The galaxy was a big place, full of strange, powerful species that humans had only recently begun to learn about. But even in this vast, starry ocean, one race stood out. They were the Arthelans, an ancient and proud species known for their intelligence, technological advances, and warrior spirit. They had ruled their corner of the galaxy for centuries, respected by many, feared by most. But everything was changing. The Rakkar, a fierce and terrifying race from a distant star system, had set their eyes on the Arthelan homeworld. The Rakkar were no ordinary invaders. Their ships were massive, built like floating fortresses, brimming with devastating weaponry that could tear planets apart. They had advanced energy weapons, deadly drones, and a fleet that seemed unstoppable. The Arthelans had fought back with everything they had. Their once glorious fleets clashed against the Rakkar in brutal space battles. They threw everything they had into the fight: fighters, warships, and even their most powerful secret weapons. But it was all for nothing. The Rakkar were too powerful. Their ships were too advanced. The Arthelans were losing. And so, in their darkest hour, when defeat was certain, they did something they had never done before. They reached out for help. They sent a desperate message, broadcast across the galaxy, hoping for a miracle. They didn't care who answered. They just needed someone, anyone, to help them survive. The message was simple, yet it carried the weight of a dying species. Attention all beings of the galaxy. This is the Arthelan High Command. Our homeworld is under siege by the Rakkar. We are fighting for our very survival. We need assistance immediately. We are sending out a distress call. Help us, and we will owe you a debt beyond measure. If you do not come, we will fall, and all our knowledge, our culture, our people, will be lost forever. It wasn't a boastful message. There were no demands. There was no pride. It was just a simple plea for help. The Arthelans were offering everything they could, even if they had nothing left to give. They begged the galaxy to save them. For weeks, they waited. And as the Rakkar continued their relentless assault, the Arthelans grew desperate. They could see their cities burning. They could see their people dying. And with each passing day, they knew the end was getting closer. But just as hope seemed lost, the answer came. It was a message, brief and to the point. It came from Earth, a distant and mysterious planet on the edge of the galaxy, home to a species that the Arthelans had never fully understood: humans. We have received your message. We will send help. Stand by, the message said. At first, the Arthelans were confused. Humans? Who were these humans? They had barely even heard of them. Sure, they had detected human ships in the galaxy before, small primitive vessels compared to the mighty fleets of the Arthelans. Humans were nothing compared to the advanced species of the galaxy. Their ships were often little more than clunky metal cans, drifting through space with little coordination or understanding of the greater galactic order. So why would humans send help? The Arthelans were unsure, but they had no other choice but to wait. Days turned into weeks. The Rakkar didn't stop. They were relentless, crushing everything in their path. But finally, a fleet arrived. It wasn't the massive, well-organized, highly advanced fleet the Arthelans had expected. No, instead, it was a small group of ships, outdated, old, and clearly not meant for combat. The Arthelan High Command watched the incoming fleet with confusion and disbelief. Their eyes scanned the ships on their screens. The human fleet was nothing like what they had imagined. These ships were old, very old. Some of them were even falling apart. They looked like they had been abandoned for years and then hastily patched together. One ship, a massive cargo hauler, had several of its outer hull panels missing. Another looked like it had been used as a fishing vessel. Its paint was chipped and peeling, and it seemed to be held together by little more than a few metal beams and bolts. "Is this the help we've been given?" an Arthelan general asked, his voice full of disbelief. The fleet had only a few dozen ships, compared to the thousands of Rakkar warships attacking the planet. The Arthelans felt a chill run down their spines. How could these humans help them? What were they thinking? As the ships got closer, the Arthelan command center went silent. A broadcast came through from one of the human ships. A voice, calm, steady, and completely at ease, came over the comms. "This is Captain Elias Grant, commanding the human fleet. We are here to help. We will do everything we can to fight the Rakhar and save your people." The voice of Captain Grant had no hint of fear or hesitation, but the Arthelans were still skeptical. How could these primitive humans think they could face the Rakhar, a race known for their deadly strength and superior technology? But Captain Grant's words weren't just empty promises. They were the truth. The humans had come to fight, and they had come with everything they had. It might not have been much, but to the Arthelans, it was better than nothing. The human fleet began to move into position, but instead of forming the kind of neat, organized formations the Arthelans expected from a battle-ready fleet, the human ships spread out chaotically. Some ships seemed to be going in different directions, like they had no idea what they were doing. One ship even appeared to be heading straight toward the Rakhar Armada. The Arthelans gasped in horror. "Are they insane?" The Arthelan ambassador muttered, watching as the human ship sped toward certain destruction. But the human fleet didn't stop. They continued to move forward, not with the grand strategies of an experienced galactic force, but with something else, a strange, unpredictable energy that was both terrifying and fascinating to watch. The Arthelan leaders waited, watching closely, unsure of what to expect. They had no idea what these strange humans were planning. But one thing was certain: they were not the kind of force the Arthelans had hoped for. As the human fleet approached the Rakhar forces, something unexpected happened. The Rakhar ships turned their attention toward the humans. The Rakhar's powerful commanders saw the small, outdated ships and thought, "This is no challenge." They laughed at the sight of them, thinking this would be the easiest victory they had ever won. But as the first few shots rang out across space, the Arthelans realized something important. The humans were not just fighting with weapons. They were fighting with something else: ingenuity. The human ships started to deploy strange, unorthodox tactics. They used their old cargo ships as distractions, sending them directly into the path of the Rakhar's mighty warships. These ships, which had no real weaponry, acted as bait, drawing the Rakhar's fire away from the more vulnerable human ships. The humans were using everything they had at their disposal, even if it wasn't much. They didn't have the biggest guns, the strongest shields, or the most powerful fleets. But they had something else that the Rakhar couldn't predict: creativity. And that was just the beginning. The Arthelans had been waiting for weeks. Every day that passed without help, they lost more of their people, more of their cities, and more of their hope. The Rakhar's relentless assault seemed endless. The Arthelan forces, once so mighty, were now on the verge of collapse, and they knew that if no help came soon, their civilization would be wiped out forever. The distress call they had sent out was their last option, the only choice they had left. And when the reply came, it was a mixed bag of emotions. The Arthelans had never truly known who humanity was, and in their desperation, they didn't care much about who answered their call for help. They needed help, any help. But when the message from Earth came through, it wasn't what they expected. "We have received your message. We will send help. Stand by." The words were simple, direct, and to the point. No promises of grand fleets or high-tech weaponry. Just a straight answer. The Arthelans were shocked. Earth, that distant, largely unknown planet on the far edge of the galaxy. Why would humanity answer a call for help? The Arthelans had only recently become aware of humanity. Their ships were small, outdated, and not anywhere near as advanced as the powerful fleets of other galactic species. Compared to the advanced ships of the Rakhar, humanity's vessels were nothing more than rusting cans drifting through space. "Surely they can't be serious," muttered one Arthelan commander as he looked at the message again. "What could they possibly send us?" But there was no time for doubt. The message had been received, and the humans had promised to help. The Arthelans had no choice but to wait and see what came next. And so they did, watching as the hours dragged into days, and the days dragged into weeks, all while the Rakkar continued their assault on the Arthelan homeworld. At first, the Arthelans didn't see any sign of the human fleet. The Rakkar were not slowing down, and the war was becoming more hopeless by the minute. The Arthelans grew anxious. They had trusted the humans to keep their word, but it was hard to believe a species that had barely begun to explore the galaxy could really help them now. The looming destruction of their world was beginning to feel like a certainty. And then it happened. One morning, the skies above their planet lit up. The Arthelan command center quickly went into full alert. They were expecting another assault from the Rakkar. But this was different. The sensors picked up dozens of ships entering their star system. They weren't Rakkar ships. These ships were coming in from a different direction, a direction that the Arthelans had not anticipated. At first, the fleet appeared small, far too small to make a difference against the might of the Rakkar. But then, the Arthelans got a closer look at the ships. Their scanners picked up strange, unidentifiable signatures. These were not ships like anything the Arthelans had seen before. They weren't sleek or powerful-looking like the Arthelan ships. No, these ships were old. Some of them looked downright ancient, barely holding together. The Arthelans exchanged confused glances. "Are those human ships?" one of them asked, his voice filled with disbelief. It was hard to believe, but yes, the ships were coming from Earth, and they were human-made. The Arthelans couldn't understand it. How could humans help them with ships like these? They were nothing like the powerful, modern fleets they had hoped for. They looked like nothing more than a ragtag collection of junk and scrap metal pieced together with little care. The Arthelan ambassador was stunned. "This is what they sent us." A senior general shook his head. "This is madness. These ships are no match for the Rakkar. How could they think this would work?" Despite their doubts, the Arthelans had no choice but to prepare for what was coming. The enemy was on their doorstep, and even these strange human ships were all they had left. They could not afford to dismiss them out of hand. So reluctantly, they watched as the human fleet approached. The ships, small and unorganized, began to move into position above the planet. The Arthelans' command center tried to make sense of what was happening. The human ships were taking strange, erratic paths, moving in ways that seemed illogical, almost reckless. Some ships were heading straight toward the Rakkar fleet, seemingly oblivious to the danger. "Are they insane?" the Arthelan ambassador asked, watching the scene unfold on their screens. "They're heading directly into the fire." But then, just as quickly as they entered the battle zone, the human ships did something unexpected. The ships that had been heading straight toward the Rakkar flagship suddenly veered off course. They didn't just flee. They engaged in what appeared to be a coordinated maneuver. At first, it was hard to understand what they were doing. But as the human ships continued to move, the Arthelans began to realize that there was method in their madness. The humans weren't retreating. They were distracting the Rakkar, pulling them off their planned course. And they weren't just running around aimlessly. Each move was calculated, even if it didn't seem that way at first. The human fleet was maneuvering in a way that made it impossible for the Rakkar to pin them down, and they were using every little thing at their disposal to throw off their enemies. The Arthelans were left watching, stunned, as the human ships didn't fight the way any advanced species would expect. They didn't go straight into battle. They didn't engage in traditional space warfare. Instead, they were using the most basic tactic of all, the element of surprise. "Captain Grant, what are you doing?" one Arthelan officer asked, watching the crazy maneuvers of the human fleet. "This doesn't make sense." But Captain Elias Grant, the commander of the human fleet, was calm as ever. His voice came through on the Arthelans' communication channels, clear and steady. "Just trust me. We'll make it work. Don't underestimate us." The Arthelans didn't know what to make of it. Their greatest minds and warriors were caught off guard by the human tactics. The Rakkar, too, were confused. At first, they laughed. What could these primitive humans possibly do? But they quickly found out. Once inside, Jake set up a small campfire, and Ilara took a seat, her mind racing with the events that had brought her to this point. She had been betrayed, hunted, and nearly killed by the very people she had trusted. And now, a human soldier, a stranger, was offering her help. "What do you want from me?" Ilara asked, breaking the silence. "You've already helped me escape. What's in this for you?" Jake looked up from the fire, his expression thoughtful. "I told you before," he said quietly. "I don't believe the story they're telling. I want to help you, because I know what it's like to be used, to be lied to. I want to make things right." Ilara studied him for a long time. There was no deceit in his voice, no hidden agenda. He was telling the truth. For the first time since the betrayal, Ilara felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. Maybe there was a way to fight back, to clear her name, and to prevent the war that seemed so inevitable. And maybe, just maybe, this human soldier would be the one to help her do it. The night grew darker, and the storm outside rumbled louder, but inside the small cabin, Ilara and Jake found a moment of peace. They sat by the fire, their differences slowly fading as they began to understand each other. In a world full of lies and danger, they had found something unexpected: trust. And with that trust came a promise. They would fight together, no matter what. The days that followed were a blur of constant movement. Ilara and Jake barely slept, barely ate, but they kept moving. Every moment felt like a race against time, and they both knew the stakes were higher than ever. They had to stay hidden, stay one step ahead of the soldiers hunting them, and find a way to prove Ilara's innocence. Ilara was still trying to process everything that had happened. Just a few days ago, she had been a guest on Earth, representing the Zorathian Empire in a diplomatic mission. Now she was on the run, with a human soldier, one she had barely known, by her side. In many ways, Jake was her only ally, but she couldn't help feeling conflicted. Humans, for all their potential, were still strangers to her. She didn't know if she could trust him completely. After all, trust was something that had been shattered by her own people. Jake, on the other hand, was starting to believe in Ilara. He had seen her fight for survival, had watched her outsmart the soldiers chasing them time and time again. But trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. He had his own demons, his own doubts about what was right and wrong. Yet, as they spent more time together, as they shared small moments of kindness and laughter, Jake found himself drawn to her, not just because of the mission, but because of who she was. As they moved deeper into the woods, far away from the cities and military bases, Jake kept a close eye on their surroundings. They were venturing into dangerous territory. There were fewer roads, fewer places to hide, and even fewer people who might help them. But they couldn't go back. There was no turning back now. The only way forward was to trust each other, to work together, and to survive. One evening, as the sky turned orange with the setting sun, they found themselves in a small clearing surrounded by trees. Jake set up a small campfire, and they sat together in silence, watching the flames flicker and dance. It was one of the few peaceful moments they had shared since the chaos began. Ilara sat with her arms crossed, her eyes distant as she stared into the fire. Jake could see that she was exhausted, physically and emotionally. "I can't believe it," Ilara murmured, breaking the silence. "I trusted them. I believed in my people. I thought I was doing the right thing." Jake watched her closely, sensing the pain in her voice. He knew what it was like to feel betrayed, to realize that the people you trusted could turn against you. "I know," he said softly. "It's hard to believe, but sometimes the truth is uglier than we want to admit." Ilara glanced at him, her violet eyes meeting his green ones. "You don't understand," she said, her voice filled with frustration. I was trained to believe in loyalty, in honor. It's part of who I am. And now it feels like everything I've ever known is a lie." Jake's heart softened. He understood more than she realized. His own experiences in the military had shown him how easily people could betray each other, how loyalty could be twisted into something ugly. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "You were just doing what you thought was right. Sometimes people take advantage of that." Ilara didn't answer. She just stared into the fire, her face shadowed by a mixture of anger and regret. Jake didn't press her. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be forced. It had to come naturally. And right now, they both needed time. The next morning, they packed up quickly. The weather had grown colder, and Ilara felt the chill in the air. She had grown accustomed to the warmer climate of Joreth, and Earth's winters were starting to feel harsher with every passing day. But there was no time to rest. They had to keep moving, and Ilara knew that Jake was doing everything he could to keep them safe. As they made their way through the forest, Jake pointed out landmarks in the distance. "We're getting closer to a small town," he said. "We can lay low for a bit there. Maybe find some supplies, and if we're lucky, we might be able to contact someone who can help us." Ilara nodded, though she felt uneasy. Every time they entered a new town or city, the danger grew. The authorities were looking for her. The Zorethian Empire was looking for her. But she had no choice. She had to trust Jake, had to trust that he knew what he was doing. When they reached the town, it was nothing like the busy cities Ilara had seen before. It was small, quiet, and isolated. Most of the houses were old, made of wood, and the streets were empty except for a few cars parked along the sides. Ilara and Jake slipped through the back alleys, careful not to draw attention. They needed food, supplies, and most importantly, information. As they approached a small store, Jake stopped. "Stay here," he whispered to Ilara. "I'll go inside and see if I can find anything. You keep an eye out. If anyone comes, we need to be ready." Ilara nodded. She had learned to stay alert, to be ready for anything. She watched as Jake disappeared into the store, and for the first time in a while, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. But that moment didn't last long. A car pulled up to the store. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. It was a black SUV, and she knew instantly that it was no coincidence. They were being watched. She quickly ducked behind a nearby dumpster, holding her breath. She could hear voices, low and muffled, but she couldn't make out the words. Whoever was inside the SUV had to be looking for her. She glanced around, hoping Jake would hurry up and come back. Seconds felt like hours. Just as she was about to move, the door to the store opened. Jake stepped out, carrying a bag of supplies. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, they both froze. Then, without warning, the SUV's doors opened. Several men stepped out, their eyes scanning the street. They were wearing dark suits, their faces serious, and Ilara knew they were no ordinary civilians. They were probably agents sent to track her down. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. Jake's eyes widened when he saw the men. He didn't hesitate. "Ilara," he shouted, his voice full of urgency. "We have to move. Now." Without thinking, Ilara darted toward him. The two of them ran as fast as they could, weaving through alleyways and jumping over fences. The men in the SUV weren't far behind. They were fast, and they had weapons. Ilara knew they couldn't outrun them forever. Jake led her toward a narrow street that seemed to go on forever. "This way," he called, pulling her along. They ran faster, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. The sound of the agent's footsteps grew louder. Suddenly, Jake stopped, grabbing Ilara's arm and pulling her into an abandoned warehouse. They crouched down behind a stack of crates, trying to catch their breath. "I'll distract them," Jake whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "You sneak in and get to the control room. I'll cover you from the outside." Ilara hesitated. "Are you sure? It's too dangerous." Jake gave her a determined look. "I'm sure. We've come this far. We're not backing down now." With one last glance at each other, they split up. Jake moved to the left, his movements swift and silent as he approached a group of guards. Ilara took a deep breath and sprinted toward the entrance of the building, her heart pounding in her chest. She could do this. She had to. Inside the communications center, the air was cold and sterile. The walls were lined with screens, each one showing a different part of the city or military base. Ilara's eyes flicked to the control room door at the end of the hall. She could hear voices approaching. She had no time to waste. She darted down the hallway, her footsteps light and quick, and slipped inside the control room. The room was dark, save for the glowing screens that lit up the walls. She quickly moved to the main console, her fingers working quickly as she accessed the system. She was almost there. Just as she was about to send the broadcast, the door burst open. 2 guards stormed in, weapons drawn. Ilara froze for a split second, her heart leaping into her throat. But then she remembered why she was here. She wasn't going to let them stop her. Not now. She lunged toward the guards, using all of her Zorathian training. Her speed and strength caught them off guard, and in a blur of motion, she disarmed them both. Before they could react, she had knocked them out cold, their bodies crumpling to the floor. With trembling hands, Ilara returned to the console. She typed in the final command to send the broadcast. The truth would be exposed. The world would know what had really happened. The conspiracy, the lies, the betrayal. It would all come to light. Just as she hit the final key, an alarm blared, loud and deafening. The entire building was on lockdown. "Ilara," Jake's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We've got company. Get out of there." She didn't waste a second. She grabbed the bag of supplies she had hidden in the corner and rushed out of the control room. The hallways were now filled with guards, and the sound of running footsteps echoed in the distance. Ilara's heart raced as she sprinted toward the exit, the weight of the truth on her shoulders. Jake was waiting for her outside, his back against the wall as he covered her escape. He fired off a few shots, forcing the guards to take cover. Ilara's breath came in sharp gasps as she ran toward him, her legs burning with exhaustion. "We need to move," Jake said, grabbing her arm and pulling her down a side alley. "They're coming for us." They ran through the streets, dodging soldiers and military vehicles. Ilara's mind was focused only on one thing, the broadcast. It had been sent. The truth was out there. It couldn't be undone. As they turned a corner, Ilara suddenly stopped, her eyes widening in horror. A group of soldiers had surrounded them, blocking their only escape route. The final stand was here. Jake took a deep breath, his gun raised and ready. It's not over yet. The soldiers closed in, but Ilara's mind was sharp. She had one last trick up her sleeve. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a small device, an EMP grenade. She had salvaged it from the communication center, and now it was their only chance. "Ilara, no," Jake shouted as she primed the grenade, but it was already too late. With a sharp click, Ilara threw the grenade toward the soldiers. The blast was deafening, sending a shockwave through the air. The soldiers dropped to the ground, their weapons useless as the EMP disrupted their electronics. "Let's go," Jake shouted, grabbing Ilara's arm and pulling her toward the final escape route. They didn't look back. Together, they ran into the night, their breaths ragged, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had just accomplished. The world would never be the same again. The battle was far from over, but the Rakhar no longer held the advantage. The human fleet had done the impossible. They had turned the tide. They had taken a losing battle and made it a fight for the future. The Arthalans watched, in awe and disbelief, as the human ships continued to fight with relentless determination. They had underestimated humanity, thinking their weaknesses would be their downfall. But in reality, it was those very weaknesses that had become their greatest strength. The true power of humanity had been revealed, not in the size of their ships or the strength of their weapons, but in their refusal to give up. And as the Rakkar retreat continued, the Arthelans knew one thing for certain. The tide had turned, and it was humanity that had turned it. The battle had been long and brutal. The Rakkar, a race that had believed their strength could never be challenged, had been forced to retreat. Their massive warships, once seen as the ultimate power in the galaxy, were now scattered and broken. Their advanced technology, which they had used to conquer countless worlds, had been exposed as vulnerable to the unexpected and unpredictable tactics of the human fleet. The humans, with their outdated ships and limited resources, had defied all expectations. They had fought not with overwhelming strength, but with something far more powerful, an unyielding will to survive. The small, seemingly insignificant fleet had turned the tide of the battle. And in doing so, they had shown the galaxy a new way of fighting. A way that didn't rely on superior firepower, but on resilience, determination, and the refusal to ever give up. As the last of the Rakkar ships fled the battlefield, the remaining human and Arthelan forces stood victorious. The human fleet had been battered and bruised, but they had held their ground. They had survived, and in doing so, they had secured the future of the Arthelans. The Arthelan commanders, who had watched the battle unfold from a distance, now stood in stunned silence. They had expected to witness the end of the Arthelan people. They had believed that the Rakkar would be unstoppable. But instead, they had witnessed something they never thought possible. A small, outmatched fleet had defeated an enemy that was once thought invincible. As the Arthelan fleet regrouped and began to assess the damage, the humans slowly began to gather their own forces. Their ships, many of which were barely functional, floated in the vast expanse of space. The damage was clear: hull breaches, shattered engines, and smoke rising from broken equipment. But despite the destruction, the human ships remained operational. Their crews were battered, tired, but they were still standing. The humans had done the impossible. They had faced a powerful enemy, one that outnumbered them by far, and they had turned the battle in their favor. Now, they were left with the aftermath, both the physical damage to their ships and the emotional weight of what they had just accomplished. The Arthelans, still in disbelief, couldn't help but admire the human spirit. Despite all odds, despite the overwhelming power of their enemy, the humans had fought with everything they had. They had used every trick, every maneuver, and every ounce of their strength to turn the tide. And in doing so, they had shown the Arthelans the true meaning of strength. The Arthelan fleet slowly moved closer to the humans. The damage to their own ships was not as severe, but they had suffered losses too. Several of their commanders had been injured, and their fleet was in disarray. But it didn't matter. They had won. And now, they had to do what they could to help the humans recover. As the Arthelans approached, the humans sent out a communication signal, their voices crackling through the transmission. "We may not have much, but we'll do what we can to help," said the captain of the human fleet, his voice tired but filled with determination. The Arthelans responded, their voices full of respect. "We owe you everything," said one of their senior commanders. "You have saved us. And in doing so, you have proven that strength is not always measured in firepower. It is measured in the will to fight, to survive." The human captain chuckled softly. "We don't need your gratitude. We did what we had to do. We were fighting for our survival, and we couldn't afford to lose."